Off the Wall Productions is proud to present Voices of the Methow. This is a series of conversations with interesting folk in and around the valley. This is a talk Washington State Poet Laureate Claudia Castro Luna gave at the Trails End Bookstore in Winthrop, Washington on September 27th, 2018.
Well, it is such a pleasure to be here. I've been here since Sunday, and I've been looking forward to this evening. In addition to, I've been looking forward to the entire week. This was in the works for quite a bit, actually, for me to be able to travel and do all the things that I've been doing, visiting schools. I am serving as the Washington State Poet Laureate. I'm the fifth person in the state to hold this position, which is a 2-year position appointed by the governor of our state. And it is a position that's supported by 2 statewide organizations, the Humanities Washington and Arts Washington. And I actually brought some material if you're curious about what Humanities Washington does. I have a brochure and a copy of their quarterly magazine, as well as some bookmarks. If you're interested in taking that, please do. I also want to say thank you to the Methow Art Alliance for inviting me, because without them, I could not have possibly come. We were in conversation months ago with their executive director, Amanda, who is I think traveling in Philadelphia and was unable to be here, but they organized my stay and they organized the visits to the schools that I have been doing, which is a tremendous amount of work. So thank you, Ashley Lodato, who organized all that for me. I really appreciate it. There's no way I could have done that. Just you have to have somebody on the ground to be able to help you navigate a place. So I am indebted to you for that. So yes, I've been traveling across the valley. I was in Okanagan, I was in Brewster, and I have been at the high school, at the local high school for 2 days in a row, doing a variety of classes. And it's been always very fulfilling. The position of Poet Laureate in the state of Washington is one that we say it's a position of service. In other states, it's more of a wearing laurels for, the work that you do. But in Washington state, the person is expected to travel across the state and share with each other, with residents of the state, our personal love of poetry, the power of words, and be an ambassador for poetry and the literary arts in general. So I'm very happy to be able to do that. I live in Seattle, so for me it means traveling lots eastward, much more than around Puget Sound. And my next big trip will be to Lewis County in a couple of weeks. So every time I do a reading as the Poet Laureate, I always begin by reading 2 poems. I read a poem written by a child in the state of Washington, and I read a poem written by a writer, an adult. And I'm going to cheat tonight because I'm going to read 2 poems written by kids, instead of one written by a kid and one by an adult. So this one was given to me when I was named laureate, and it was written by Balti, who's a 5th grader. He's in 6th grade now, and it's called Free Poem. A poem is a sea of words crashing on the shore, a bittersweet candy sitting in the store, a drop of blood in a cup of lemonade, a narwhal swimming in icy waters while singing about the stars. A poem is when Orion rises shining in the night sky, when a leaf glides down from a tree, when everything is nothing and nothing can be anything. A poem is my freedom. And that is a student in 5th grade. Yes. Isn't that amazing? Kids are amazing. And then I'm going to read another poem. This one was originally written in Spanish by an 8th grader. And her name is Michelle Carranza, and she's now a 9th grader. I have had the fortune of teaching at a school in South Seattle for the past 4 years in a dual immersion program. It's a middle school, but the kids who are there some of them are Spanish native speakers, and others are kids who've been taking in an immersion class since they're in kindergarten. So they're non-native speakers who have quite a high degree of fluency in Spanish, and they're studying language arts in Spanish. So it's an amazing program. And I go in and I teach for a few weeks each year, and this year the theme was we come from everything, venimos de todo. And the idea was that that nature lives inside of us as we are also part of the environment, and then thinking about our impact on the environment and as well as what nature and the environment gives us. So that was the theme of the running theme. So I'll read the original first, which was in Spanish. Michelle wrote it in Spanish, and then I'll read the English version. So, el árbol dentro de mí. En el río de los recuerdos, las raíces de mi árbol buscan la seguridad de un lugar de siempre. Caras familiares, amigos del pasado, el tronco fuerte y alto resiste como un faro la tormenta de pensamientos. No se deja caer, aunque las olas lo empujen y empujen entre el vacío de las palabras y el silencio de mi cuerpo. Aún así, mis ramas tratan de alcanzar una aventura lejana entre planetas y estrellas. The tree inside me. In the river of memory, the roots of my tree search for security. Yesterday places, familiar faces, friends of the past. My trunk, strong and tall, resists like a lighthouse thunderstorms of thought. It refuses to fall, even after wave shove it between the emptiness of words and the silence of my body. Even then, my branches clamor a faraway adventure among planets and stars. So that is 8th grade, Michelle Carranza. Isn't that crazy? That's an incredible poem. So before I go on, I actually made a terrible omission, which is to thank the bookstore for hosting all of us today, for hosting me, for inviting me, and for inviting all of you, and actually to thank you for taking part of your evening to come and join me this afternoon. I really appreciate it, and I think that when I do readings, I always relish the community that we become for the moment in which the reading lasts. That is a community that is built on words, and that it's a community that coalesces around beauty, which is what literature does. So I love that. So I am going to read from my new book, which is Killing Marias. But before that, I have a short poem I wanted to read. I have 2 poems. And then I'll read from Killing Marias. I need a stand normally, so we're going to improvise. So this poem that I'm going to read is about El Salvador. And this is what we call a prose poem. It has a story running through it, a storyline running through it. And I am from El Salvador. I came to the U.S. when I was 14 years old in 1981. My family was fleeing the Civil War that was officially declared like 2 weeks after my family left. So we left January 17th, and I think like 2 weeks later, the war was officially declared as a civil war, but of course it had been happening for years before that. And some of you in the room, I'm sure, remember the news of El Salvador being on television. I was telling the kids that El Salvador was like Syria in the 80s, where no matter where in the world you were, you tuned into the radio or newspaper, and there were news about El Salvador because it was a very violent place. And I have a lot of trauma around it and have been unable to return to El Salvador, not because I don't want to go, I very much want to go, but it's very hard to sort of overcome the fear of having lived there. But I did go. I received a grant. I applied to a grant. I actually just finished writing a prose book about this. And I was in the middle of working on this book, and I applied for this grant. And some people said, they don't grant travel. That's not a travel grant. And I thought, let me try. I'll apply, to go and do research. And if I get it, that'll be great. And actually, if I get it, that means I'll have to go, because you have to report back on grants. And I thought, if I don't get it, then I don't have to go. And so in a way, it was a way of forcing myself to take on traveling back to overcome this fear that I have. And guess what? I got the grant. And I waited. I waited and I waited and I waited, and I booked my flight until I had like a few months left before the grant expired. So finally I went, and it was interesting being there. I've only been to El Salvador 3 times in 38 years that I've lived in the US. It was interesting going with a sense of purpose. So I was able to travel to places that were, during the war, these were places that were free zones, they were called. And so civilians, unless you lived in these mountain areas, you really didn't go there. And we were not from that part of the country, so I was able to explore El Salvador as an adult with a different lens, with a purpose, and it was interesting being there. And this poem comes from that trip, which is the last time I was there, I think 3 years ago. And it's titled Ask the Bees. On my last trip to El Salvador, spiraling down a remote mountain highway, I spotted a woman and her child sitting on the side of the road. A sun-bleached umbrella cast shade on her and on a table stacked with unlabeled glass vessels filled with honey. Behind her, a steep gorge, an emerald wound, hummed a tune that told of the beginning of things. The honey came from there, she said, pointing at the jungle below. Mystery of forest, mystery of honey, necessity of survival, this mother making a living from the industriousness of hirsute insect fairies harvesting nectar and iridescent powdered from wild flowers, making beauty edible. Her honey emanated a neon glow bright and potent, as if alive. The pulsating force of the gorge, the song of the torogos, the roar of the jaguar, the gloss of the leaves, the soil, volcanic ash, hung suspended inside each container. For us to remember this brilliant day, I said to Papa, handing him a jar, this day when we stood arm in arm and talked about the war, what it took from all of us, a day when I asked him to name every tree, every flower we came across, and he did. He named them all, a gesture that said, we are from here, from this forsaken place where we know the names of things. On my return at Dallas Airport, a customs officer confiscated my jar. Later, in a cafe waiting for my flight to Seattle, I felt my cheeks wet, my tears like a meandering rivulet through the lush terrain that sustained the bees, that made the honey, that helped the woman help herself. In the airport's sterile setting, I considered the honey of things, how much time would have to pass before I'd walk alongside my papa once more. How is it that we overlook what is important? We value the wrong things. What would they say about the meaning of grief if I asked them? Bees who turn sun's fire to an edible gem. Magicians and scientists at once, they have for millennia healed us, nourished us, pollinated this blue planet we call home. Those ancient alchemists hunting for the truth and power to transmute base metals into gold searched in vain. Bees have known the secret all along, transforming with exquisite care, which is also love, yellow dust into liquid gold. And that is my bee poem. Actually, that really sounds like a love poem when I think about it. I always tell my students that I don't write love poems. I don't write romantic love poems, that's not my nature. You know, I don't go there. But I have written love poems about books and libraries. And reading that just now, I realized that really is a love poem too. So, right, we interpret things differently. A poem could be many things depending on when we hear it and our mood and where we are. And that is one of its beauties, right? That it changes as we change as well. So before I read from that, from my book, I'll read this poem. I give my children poems for Valentine's. I've been doing it for a while. I have 3 kids. And it used to be that I used to write one for each kid. And then I got really busy. And for the last couple of years, I just write one, and then I share it. And so the morning of Valentine's, they get up and they come to breakfast, and there's a poem waiting for them. So this year, I am learning typesetting, And I actually typeset the poem that I gave them. I'm really proud of this. This is the only thing I've ever done. I know if you guys are letterpress people here will laugh at me, but I typeset this poem. So this is called Fuel, and it's also a love poem. Fuel. Feed me, said the heart, and the mother did. Nourished it with roses and spearmint, rain scent, the lift under kestrel's wings. 3 times a day, year after year, with the spoon tucked in her breast pocket, she fed it until it grew strong of arm and leg, until it understood that joy is joy and fear real, even when the thing that scares has long ago disappeared. And of course, that harkens back to my PTSD, which I now understand that it is that. I didn't for a long time, but I know that that's what it is. And that is what's so hard about returning to El Salvador. So I'll read a few poems from this book. On October 13th, Washington State Book Awards will be announced. And this is one of the finalists in the category of poetry. And I'm really happy about that. Both, of course, because it's my book, but more than that, because of the women that I write about, and it is their story that I'm trying to capture with this poem, so I am very happy for that. So, October 13th, I will get up and I will give a keynote address to teachers in the state of Washington in the morning at 10 a.m., and then I will teach. Then I have to take my daughter to a PTSA test and another daughter to a climbing. I have a rock climber in my house. And then I will teach a workshop at one of the libraries. And then in the evening is the award ceremony. And I don't know if I will make it to that. I don't know if I'll make it that far. So a little setup on this book. So this book contains 45 poems. 43 are written to specific women. The entire book is written to particular women, and the poems bear the names of these women. And in the back of the book are the actual names of the women to whom I have written these poems. And the names came from a list of several hundred names of women who were killed in Juarez, Mexico. Does anybody know where that is? Yeah. So Juarez is a border town, right? On one side is El Paso, and the other side is Juarez. And this is, it's a border town. There's a lot of people work in one city and live in another. So there's a back and forth there. And of course, the Mexican side does not resemble the U.S. side. The Mexican side is a very violent place. And in the 90s, and it continues to this day, hundreds of women were killed and left in ditches, often dismembered. And when I came across a website with the names of these women, I could not believe it, that I did not know. I mean, I'm a generally informed person. I watch the news, I read the paper, and I was surprised that I didn't know to the extent of these murders, that there were hundreds of women. And once I started digging in, most of them were very young, 18 to 24 maybe. But as I dug in further, I also found that some of the women were younger, 12, 10, 13. And I found that there were older women, 65, 35, 40. So it seemed to me that in this, some of the articles that I read called it a Mexican safari, that some of these women were essentially almost hunted down, and they looked almost, the young ones, a lot of had a very similar phenotype. But that there were also older women that didn't fit that profile, that it seemed to me were the victims of domestic violence cases. And because nobody was ever prosecuted in Juarez, and no one has been brought to justice, that there was a general kind of violence against women, and the term femicide comes from that. That was just unchecked. And so that's what this book is, an honoring of those women. And you will hear me, when I read the book, I read the poems straight. So I will not stop between the poems. They're very short. Some of them are very, very short. So I'll read 10 of them straight through. And you will hear me call the name of the person. So the titles of the poems are the women's names. Most of them have 2 names. And the last name, instead of the last name, I have used either a poetic phrase of my own thinking, of my own inspiration, or a line from the Catholic prayer, Litanies of the Virgin Mary, which is quite a beautiful prayer. So I sort of am splicing flesh and spirit, if you will, in the titles of the poems. I will finish with this, and then we could have a little Q&A session after that. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'll read straight through. Maria Agustina Mystical Rose, dearly beloveds, women's names, pebbles under a stream flowing out to sea, hold them in your mouth. Taste the oval shapes, their perfect randomness. Taste the bitter and salt, petal and sweet. Ears cannot touch what tongues can see. Maria Cristina Hanging Chrysalis. What would I do for a smidgen of your rebellion, Maria, as a woman to trust the halo of your intuition? I know you know courage plummets easily from cliffs of doubt, both imposed and self-harvested. How to make manifest what the mind knows but the eye cannot yet see. How to pluck hope from the terrace gardens where it grows. I think about the nature of change, the transfiguration of grain to woman, the audacity of salt to embolden water into ocean, the urge to break free. Maria de Jesus, Mother of Rain. There in the mirror staring me down is you, from the place where love burns and roads meet. Maria de Lourdes, Song of Plenty. When the belt seared me that time, the sun inside me burst corn yellow. Urine streamed down, scorching my raw legs, swollen in ridges from his lashings. I was 4, maybe 5, when darkness settled, wounded and shameful, in a corner of the universe held by my rib cage. But my tongue, winged bug, saved itself and flew to perch atop the moon. I thirst, yet for all the light I drink, the now gray-black discoloration around my ribs cannot brighten. Still, my tongue has grown, is now a winged and taloned beast, and on clear nights it comes home to roost. Maria del Rosario, Merciful Virgin. Love me not, love me not. Ah, Margarita, dear Daisy, what is it that people we love and need so often destroy us? Maria Isabel, Cup of Morning Sun. How many among us bear marks, blue-green like gasoline rainbows under long-sleeved shirts? How many among us bear marks, abuse watermarks in the lining of a lukewarm smile? How many among us swing between courage and defeat in the span of a day, in the span of an hour, in the swing of a second? And the last 3. Maria Santos, Queen assumed to heaven. Oh, dark flower, who says roses don't come from ideas? Maria Santos, Sweetest Apple. They say we live on either side of a border. I say that's fodder for a sexist imagination. Coyote's tooth does not alone bite, and falcon's feather takes not alone to the sky. Silo living is not for living things, like the braid on my abuela's back and beads on a rosary strand. Interlinked, we are rain, dust, stars. And the last one is just titled Maria. Maria, and it's the last poem in the book. May the flower of your birth open up each day, receive into its depth sun's honey rays, and at night gently may it fold its petals in sacred mystery. May it release its perfume in sorrow as in joy. May its essence bloom for long. Let us all remember on this and every day, however compelling, words are not flesh. Figurative language, life does not replace. Thank you. They are much somber poems in the book. And I think when I think in terms of crafting those poems, it was an interesting exercise to write about these women because they no longer have agency. So how do we as writers talk about agency in someone who's no longer there? And then also how can the language be of such tonality that it could counter in a way the heaviness of the subject matter? And that is sort of the tension that's happening in the poems from a writerly point of view. So I am very happy to answer questions either about the book or about, I don't know, about becoming a writer or what I do and love to do, etc. Yeah?
Will you tell people about the project that you envision for the coming year?
Oh, yeah. Yes, thank you for reminding me. So each of the poet laureates have had a project that they have proposed to the panel who eventually makes the recommendation that goes to the governor to become a poet laureate. So Todd Marshall did that beautiful anthology, which, by the way, will be honored at that ceremony on October 13th. They couldn't categorize it under any of the other topics, so they're going to give it its own recognition because it's such a wonderful book that has the voices from so many people across the state. So I'm very happy for Todd and Seychelles Press for putting out that book. And one of my projects that I proposed was to do a digital, it's a digital book. And it's modeled after a project I did when I served as Seattle's Poet Laureate, which in Seattle is called Seattle Civic Poet is the title. And when I was serving in that position, my culminating project was a digital map, a street grid of Seattle. The map is called Seattle Poetic Grid, and you could go online. And when you go online, you see a map of Seattle, and on it are little blue dots on this map. And when you click on the blue dot, you open up a window, and the window has a photograph and a poem about the very place where the dot is dropped, and also the coordinates of the street. So it will have the street name. So it will say Pike Place at First and Pike or something like that. And so it was my interest when I did that because before becoming a poet, I was an urban planner at one point in my life, and so I'm very interested in the junction between self and place. So thinking about how place affects who we are and how we move, how it limits us and how it expands us, depending on where we live. And so I think a lot about that, and I wanted with this project to have as many voices from Seattle talk about what it's like to live in Seattle at this very particular time. Seattle is undergoing tremendous changes. And so the poems came from all over. I did workshops in the library. I asked for poems for kids in schools, and I curated the map. So I think there's 2 poems of mine, teeny ones. And then all the other poems some are long, some are youth, wrote the poems, some are kids, some are seniors. Some people had never written a poem, and the first poem that they ever wrote is up there. Some people have written books, and their poems are up there. And some people are no longer alive, like Marilyn DeFreers, whom I love. She lived in Ballard, and there's a poem there. Or Rutke has a poem at the UW. And, people who lived and loved Seattle and who are, for me, as much part of the city as they were when they were alive. And so I proposed to do a similar map for the state of Washington, but it would be different because it can't be at a street level. That'd be silly because it's such a huge territory. But it will essentially, when you open up the map, it will be a map of the state of Washington, and it will show, I'm using transportation corridors as a way of providing some sort of glue to the poems. So it will have some roads on it, not a lot, because it can't be too visually overwhelming. But you will see some roads, and then you will see little dots, and the dots will hide poems behind them, just like the the Seattle map does. So it's very much modeled after that other map. And so these days that I've been at the schools, I've been writing with kids, encouraging them to write poems of place, encouraging kids to tell me what it's like to live here. Because I always wonder, Washington State is so geographically diverse that I think people who live in the San Juans don't have the experience of living here, right? Like I was in a class and one of the kids said we were describing the landscape and a girl said, but in the winter it's all white. And I hadn't thought about that. And I thought, yes, of course, this must be very different. And so what is it like to live in this place in the winter, And I want people to find out. And I want it to come across in this carefully chosen language, which is what we use when we write a poem. And so hopefully I'll have the map ready at the beginning of the year, and then we'll collect poems as my tenure ends in 2020, in February of 2020, and there'll be time I'll put out an open call. You're all invited to submit poems when the open call goes out, but that's if you're curious about it, look up the Seattle Poetic Grid. It's an interesting project. Yeah?
Beyond the names of the women in the Maria's project, how much biographical information did you expose yourself to when crafting those poems?
Oh, that book took me 7 years to write. The first draft of those poems was all about how the women were found. So I try to do as much research as possible. I couldn't find information about each one, but the ones I found, it was very striking and very difficult to write and read and just craft those poems. It was emotionally very difficult. And as I wrote subsequent drafts, I realized that it was just so hard that nobody would want to read a book like that. Like, I want to honor the women. That is my purpose. But if it was so hard, then who would want to read it, And I also began to think of other things. I began to think of the issue of domestic violence and what does that mean, because it's blended into that as well. And just the issue of representation of women's bodies in general out in the media and in magazines. So I take that on as well. And then at one point I thought, if I'm writing about these women without ever having met them, and they cannot talk themselves, then I should also have some of myself in there. And so that poem that you heard me talk about, physical abuse, that is me. And there's another poem, so there's a couple of poems in the book where it's really me as the author working through this idea of domestic violence. I was a child there. And I've said, writing the book forced me also to think about the complexity of that word, because I always thought domestic violence referred to relationships, romantic relationships. And as I worked in that, I've come to understand that it also includes family members. It also includes children who are physically abused or verbally abused. And so I think it forced me to have a better grasp of that term. And writing does that, right? Writing is a journey of discovery. And so it did that. So then it broadened the scope of the work, because there's also, I consider the fact that most of the women worked. They worked in factories, because the border is a free trade zone. Then there's a lot of factories there that get breaks for putting together clothing or electronics parts and things like this. And that labor is cheap female labor. And those are the women who are the victims of this horrible femicide. And so just thinking about how our choices and our purchasing of things goes down this spiral, this rabbit hole that may be supporting some factory that has very little worker support for these women. That kind of global thinking is also in the book. Yeah, but it took me a long time, many revisions, many drafts, many workshops to try to refine and chisel down and think about what is it really with clarity that I'm trying to do and say. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
¿En español o en inglés?
Escribo en inglés. Mhm. Yeah, when I came to the States when I was 14, I didn't speak any English at all. I spoke maybe 3 words. And so I had to learn. I learned, obviously. You know, over the years, I just write in. I write in English when I write. Sometimes a poem comes, or the beginning of a poem in Spanish, and I follow that, and I will write the poem in Spanish. But my work is mostly in English. Yeah.
When did you begin writing poetry, and why did you begin writing poetry?
I started writing poems in college. I was in Southern California, and I started writing there. I did a year abroad in France, so I was in France, and I was studying literature, and some of those early poems were attempts at writing poems in French, and in Spanish too, and in English also. And but I didn't show them to anybody. I didn't share my work with anyone. It was hard. It took courage. It takes courage, you know. And it wasn't until many, many years later. I mean, writing was always with me, and a lot of times I would write things that would somehow start shaping into a poem. It just naturally I would go into that, and it was sometimes annoying that happened, because that's not what I wanted, you know. And so it was more like I really truly feel that poetry chose me rather than me choosing to write poems. I think it got to the point where I started taking evening classes in a community college, and I loved it and went back and took another class. And then I took another class, and then I found out that a nearby college offered an AA, an associate's degree in poetry, so I transferred to that. I thought that was the neatest thing, and did classes there. And then at one point, it was obvious that I needed to write, that's what I had always wanted to do, and that, you know, I turned myself over to poetry. Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad too.
You always liked to write as a young child. Did you journal?
Yes, I did. Yes. And actually, to your question about writing in English, so when we came to the U.S., my aunt gave me a journal. And in the journal, the first couple of pages are in Spanish, and then I purposely switched to English because I wanted to learn. And so the first entries in the journal are written in English and you could see the writer there, you know, I'm not writing creatively or anything, just trying to say things and forcing myself to say them in English to practice, because I wanted to learn. And all the sort of the grammar, the words in English, but the grammar following a Spanish syntax, you know. And so that to me is very interesting to see how I made a conscious choice because I wanted to learn English, and then once I did, I just did, you know. I sort of embraced the language. I also think I have studied a lot in graduate school, so I have several graduate degrees in various areas, and so the vocabulary that I'm able to manage at this point as an adult is much broader in English, which facilitates writing, I think. And I think that's another reason why I tend to write in English, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So this work makes me think of Roberto Bolaños'
Yes,
work.
yes,
His
yes.
depiction,
Yeah.
which is very much a depiction of the city.
Yeah.
But it seems like that, as I remember, it's mostly men, and you capture women here.
Yes, you know, as a matter of fact, Roberto Bolaños wrote a 626. That's the book that you're referring to, I think. And when I was writing this, I was so concerned about those drafts that were so intense, you know, that somebody said, go read 626 and then talk about intense. And I remember I went, and he's got a section in that book where it's just listing of names. And it's pages of pages of pages of names of victims. And I thought it was women because it was a while back that I read it. But what struck me was, okay, so here's this book that dedicates like 175 pages of listing of names. And then I stopped worrying about it. I was like, I only have 43 names. I could work with that.
No, but
Yeah.
when it comes to like the crimes and the whole scene around Juarez, he only depicts a lot of men. He doesn't really represent any women the way you do.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yes. This is very purposely geared toward the women. Yeah, because they're silenced, Thank you for bringing that up. I definitely went and read. I did not read the whole book. I just found a section where he's just listing names and names. And I thought, if he did it, why can't I do it? This is not even that many, It sort of gave me license to try to continue and not abandon my project. Because the project, I would work on it like with a lot of diligence, and then I would have to put it away. And then I came back to it. And so that's I think in part why it took so long. It took all those years to do. Yeah.
Would you be willing to read one more and read the one?
Oh, yeah.
It's such a delightful.
Yes, I will read it. I have it here. I'll close with this poem, which you are welcome to take. It's a bookmark. Every poet laureate gets a bookmark. So Humanities Washington said, we need a photograph that you like because it's going to go on this. Todd Marshall, I think, had a pencil drawing. This is a photograph of Lopez Island sky. And a friend of mine has a cabin there and gave me this for my birthday. It's a big photo. And I love it so much, I said, how about a photo of Lopez Island's sky, night sky? And that's what this is. So they took my picture for my friend. And then they said, we need a poem. And I thought, oh, that's kind of hard. It has to be a little one that could fit. I had this dream. This is verbatim a dream that happened to me. And I say this because this is what I tell students, that poetry is everywhere where we are. It shows up all the time. We don't have to look very hard for it, nor use fanciful language to express what it is we're feeling. And it shows up in dreams very often. It does this for me. So I always have a little pad by my bed where I jot down thoughts or images. It's very richly imagistic, dreams are. And so it's really great for writers to, at least for me. It works for me. Anyhow, so I had this dream, I jotted down, and then when they asked me for a poem, I went back to this dream and crafted this into a poem. But it really is like, this is how it happened. And I titled it Evening Bandit. In my dream, the troll walked out of his cave, sparkling with the loot of centuries, came to where I stood alone in a forest dale, and demanded all the words I had. Give me all of them, he snarled. Give me the green ones dappled with sunlight, the slick ones like pebbles on a river's edge, the ones impermeable as raven's feathers. Leave not one behind, he threatened. I want those that throb and ache, the pithy and the paltry ones too. Words, he exalted to the heavens, are the greatest treasure, more precious than gems, ever more valuable than gold. And that is true. Yes. And thank you. I woke up from the dream and I was struck that this thing showed up and said, give me your words. This is why I wrote the dream down, because I thought, whoever asked for words? That is so weird. But the neat thing about the dream was that I said no. I stood up for myself and I told him, no, you cannot, because I could sense in the dream that if I gave him my words, I would no longer be able to think. And I value thinking above everything. And so I thought, how am I going to think if I give him my words? We think in language. And I knew he would be rich and I would be nothing. I would be an object at that point. And so that's why I wrote the dream. I thought, how interesting, this thing that happened in this dream, When I came to the U.S. as a 10th grader, I was placed in all remedial classes. And it really was difficult because people couldn't understand that because I couldn't speak English, or the association was, you don't speak English, therefore you cannot think. And that killed me because I could think, I just couldn't say what I was thinking in your language. I could say it in mine, and so it was I think that's partly why I was so driven to learn, was because I wanted to show people I'm able to think, And I think that is an easily made mistake. And I think that's coming back to that dream. It's something that is important to me, the ability to think. And so I think that's why it's coming back 38 years later in that dream. Anyhow, thank you so much for coming tonight. I appreciate it. Yeah.
You've been listening to Voices of the Methow, an off-the-wall production. Until next time, thanks for listening.